There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over an old house after its owner has gone, a stillness in the air where a voice used to be, a cold spot on the floor where a chair once sat. In the rolling hills of upstate New York, there is a farmhouse called Steepletop. For years, it was the sanctuary and the prison of one of America's most electrifying poets. If you had visited in the autumn of 1950, you might have found her there, a tiny woman with flame-red hair, lost in the cavernous silence of her own life. You might have found her clutching a glass of wine, her once luminous eyes clouded by pain and memory, a ghost haunting the rooms that were supposed to have been her refuge. This was Edna St Vincent Millay. To a generation that came of age in the Roaring Twenties, she wasn't just a poet, she was a proclamation. She was the woman who burned her candle at both ends, the defiant, dazzling icon of Greenwich Village, who lived and loved with a ferocity that both scandalized and mesmerized a nation. Her words were on everyone's lips, her affairs were the subject of endless gossip, and her beauty was the kind that artists and photographers desperately tried to capture, but never quite could. She was freedom, she was rebellion, she was the new woman personified. But the flame that burns twice as bright burns half as long. The story of her public triumph is well known. What is less known is the private tragedy that unfolded behind the walls of her fame. It's a story of excruciating physical pain, of a crippling dependency on morphine, of devastating loss, and a crushing loneliness that consumed her in the end. How did the woman who so defiantly celebrated life end up so profoundly broken by it? To understand her, we have to look past the myth of the carefree bohemian and find the fragile, brilliant, and deeply wounded human being who paid an impossible price for burning so brightly. To appreciate the explosion that was Edna St Vincent Millay, you first have to understand the world she was born into. The year was 1892, and America was still firmly in the grip of the Victorian era. It was a world of rigid social codes, of corsets and conformity, especially for women. In the small, windswept coastal towns of Maine, where Millay grew up, a woman's life was expected to follow a single, narrow path: a respectable marriage, motherhood, and a quiet life dedicated to domestic duties. The idea of a woman living independently, let alone pursuing a public career, expressing radical opinions, or taking multiple lovers, was not just unconventional. It was unthinkable, a one-way ticket to social ruin. This was a world lit by gaslight and powered by steam, where society was governed by what was left unsaid, by appearances, and by a strict moral code that demanded restraint and propriety. But beneath this placid surface, the tectonic plates of culture were beginning to shift. The turn of the century brought with it the rumble of modernism, the rise of the suffrage movement, and new radical ideas about art, politics, and personal freedom. A generation was coming of age that felt stifled by the old world and was hungry for something new, something authentic, something that reflected the thrilling, chaotic, and often terrifying pace of modern life. It was into this charged atmosphere, this clash between a dying Victorian world and a nascent modern one, that Millay emerged. She was not just a product of her time, she became its voice. Her life and her work would become a battleground where these two Americas collided. She would take the old traditional forms of poetry, like the sonnet, and pour into them the raw, defiant, and unapologetically modern emotions of a woman claiming her own life. Her rebellion wasn't just personal. It was a cultural declaration of independence, and it would set her on a trajectory that was as brilliant as it was dangerous. Her story begins not in a bustling city, but in the rugged, isolated beauty of Rockland, Maine. She and her two sisters, Norma and Kathleen, were raised not by a traditional family, but by a force of nature named Cora Vincent Millay. In 1904, in an act of almost unheard of courage for the time, Cora divorced her shiftless husband and raised her 3 daughters alone. She was a district nurse working tirelessly to support her family, often leaving the girls to fend for themselves for days at a time. They were poor, so poor that the 3 sisters often shared a single bed. But their home was rich in what truly mattered to Cora: literature, music, and a fierce spirit of independence. Cora recognized her middle daughter's prodigious talent early on. She called her Vincent, a name Millay would use with her family for the rest of her life. Cora filled their small house with books, from Shakespeare to the classics, and instilled in her daughters a deep love for art and a belief that they could achieve anything, regardless of their gender or their poverty. It was Cora who submitted Vincent's epic poem, Renaissance, to a literary contest in 1912. The poem, written when Millay was just 19, is a staggering work of philosophical depth and technical mastery, a story of spiritual death and rebirth that feels astonishingly mature. When the contest anthology, The Lyric Year, was published, the literary world was aghast. The 4 judges had awarded the first prize to another poet, and a scandal erupted. Critics and readers alike declared that Renaissance was by far the best poem in the collection, and the controversy catapulted the unknown young woman from Maine to national fame. One reader, a wealthy arts patron named Caroline B. Dow, was so moved by the poem that she offered to pay for Millay's college education. And so at the age of 21, far older than her classmates, Millay entered Vasser College. Her years there were brilliant and tumultuous. She was already a published, famous poet, and she chafed under the strict rules of the women's college. She was a theatrical, charismatic, and rebellious presence on campus, writing plays, acting, and developing a reputation for flouting authority. She also began exploring her sexuality, forming passionate, intense relationships with other women, a pattern that would continue throughout her life. She was nearly expelled just before graduation for repeatedly breaking curfew, and was only allowed to receive her diploma after the college president was inundated with petitions and protests. After Vasser, she made the pilgrimage that was destined for her, a move to New York City's Greenwich Village. It was the absolute epicenter of American bohemianism, a cauldron of artists, writers, radicals, and revolutionaries who were determined to create a new way of life. And in the village of the late 1910s and early 1920s, Edna St Vincent Millay was not just another resident. She was royalty. Tiny at just over 5 feet tall, with her striking red hair and a captivating voice, she was an electrifying presence. She joined the famed Provincetown Players, acting alongside and having affairs with fellow writers like Floyd Dell and John Reed. She lived a life of unapologetic freedom, moving from one cold water flat to another, taking lovers as she pleased, both male and female, and documenting it all in her poetry. This was the era when she wrote First Fig, the 4-line poem that would become the anthem for the entire Jazz Age generation. My candle burns at both ends. It will not last the night. But ah, my foes, and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light. That single stanza captured the exhilarating, self-destructive, and beautiful defiance of her life and her time. In 1923, her fame reached its zenith. She was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry for her collection, The Harp Weaver and Other Poems, becoming the first woman to be so honored. At just 31, she was a literary superstar, a critical and commercial success whose poetry readings packed auditoriums across the country. But the lovely light of her candle was already beginning to cast long, dark shadows. The relentless pace of her life, combined with a series of illnesses, had left her utterly exhausted. It was during this period of burnout that she met Eugen Jan Boisseven, a handsome worldly Dutch importer and the widower of the famed labor activist Ines Milholland. He was 12 years her senior, and he was completely captivated. He saw in her not just a brilliant artist, but a fragile human being who needed protection from the world and from herself. They married in 1923, but it was a marriage on their own unconventional terms. Millay was brutally honest with him. She told him she was not built for monogamy and that she would not be faithful. In a testament to his deep love for her, Eugen agreed. He accepted her for exactly who she was and offered her a partnership built on freedom, honesty, and his unwavering devotion. He became her anchor. He gave up his own importing business to manage her career, her finances, and her health. He was her buffer against the demands of fame, her chef, her gardener, and her fiercest protector. 2 years after they married, they bought a sprawling, dilapidated farmhouse on over 700 acres of land in Austerlitz, New York. They named it Steepletop. It was meant to be their sanctuary, a place where Millay could escape the pressures of public life and focus on her writing. For a time, it was. They slowly restored the house and cultivated the land, and it became the backdrop for some of her most mature work. But over the years, this beautiful, isolated property would transform from a refuge into a gilded cage, a place of profound loneliness and pain. The turning point, the single event that irrevocably altered the course of her life and sent her spiraling into a tragedy from which she would never fully recover, happened in 1936. This is the part of her story that is rarely discussed in detail, but it is the secret key to understanding her later life. While on Sanibel Island, Florida, she was riding in a station wagon when the door suddenly flew open, and she was thrown violently out onto the hard road. The accident resulted in catastrophic and permanent damage to the nerves along her spine. From that moment on, she was in constant, excruciating pain. It was a searing, unrelenting agony that made it difficult to sit, to stand, to sleep, and, most devastatingly, to write. The doctors of her era had few effective, non-addictive treatments for chronic nerve pain. They prescribed the one thing they knew could offer relief: morphine. At first, the morphine was a miracle. It dulled the agony and allowed her to function, to continue her work. But as the years wore on, her tolerance grew and her need for the drug became more desperate. Her life, once a whirlwind of social engagements and love affairs, began to shrink, contracting to the perimeter of Steepletop in the grim cycle of pain and medication. Her husband, Eugen, became her primary nurse. He administered her injections, managed her prescriptions, and watched in despair as the brilliant, vibrant woman he loved began to recede, replaced by a recluse battling a dual dependency on morphine and alcohol, which she used to manage the drug's side effects. This private torment was her new reality. The woman who had once been the icon of freedom was now a prisoner in her own body, chained to a chemical dependency she could not break. Her letters from this period are heartbreaking. She wrote to Eugen, "The pain is an insult to the intelligence," a perfect, tragic summation of how her physical suffering was an assault on her brilliant mind. This devastating, life-altering accident and its consequences are the hidden tragedy behind the myth of Edna St Vincent Millay. It wasn't a life of indulgence that broke her. It was a life of unbearable, unending physical pain. The emotional landscape of Millay's life was as dramatic and complex as any of her poems. Her inner world, especially after the accident, was a place of deep contradictions. She was fiercely private, yet her poetry was often radically confessional. She craved love and companionship, yet she often pushed away those who were closest to her. At the center of this emotional vortex was her relationship with her husband. Eugène Boissevin's devotion to her was absolute and almost terrifying in its completeness. He sacrificed his own ambitions, his own identity, to become the caretaker of her genius. He shielded her from the world, cooked her meals, typed her manuscripts, and managed the farm at Steepletop. But it was a heavy burden. Friends who visited Steepletop in the later years described an atmosphere of intense, sometimes suffocating devotion. Eugene's life revolved entirely around Millay's needs, her writing schedule, her fragile health, her volatile moods. He was her everything, husband, nurse, manager, and protector. Was it the ultimate act of love or a tragic codependency that ultimately enabled her addictions while isolating them both? In a letter, Eugène once wrote of their life, "The most important thing is that Vincent should be able to work. It is for this that we have arranged our lives as we have." This single sentence reveals the immense pressure and sense of purpose that defined their marriage. Everything was for Vincent's art. The emotional toll on Eugène was immense. In 1944, a fire broke out at Steepletop, completely destroying a barn where he had stored his life's work, a massive, meticulously compiled manuscript of a historical study. Millay, in a haze of morphine and alcohol, had been careless with a cigarette. While it was an accident, the loss was catastrophic for Eugène, and it placed an immense strain on their already fraught relationship. He had given everything to her art, and now his own life's work was literally ashes. After Eugène died of a stroke in 1949, Millay's isolation became absolute. He had been her shield, her connection to the world, and without him, she was completely adrift. The depth of her grief and dependency was revealed in a heartbreakingly simple yet profoundly telling detail. After his death, she could no longer bear to sleep in the bedroom they had shared. The emptiness was too much. For the last year of her life, she slept on a couch or sometimes even on the floor, a nomad in her own home, unable to find comfort in the space that was once filled with his presence. This small private act of grief speaks more about her inner world than any public statement could. It shows a woman utterly lost, haunted by the ghost of the one person who had understood both her savage beauty and her terrible fragility. The controversies surrounding Millay were not confined to her private life. They were an essential part of her public identity. From the very beginning, she was a figure who challenged the conventions of her time. Her open bisexuality and her string of affairs with both men and women were not hidden secrets, but an open, unapologetic part of her life in Greenwich Village. In an era when such behavior was deeply scandalous, she simply refused to be ashamed. Her sonnet, "I, being born a woman and distressed," is a perfect example of her revolutionary attitude. In it, she acknowledges the physical desire she feels for a man, but coolly dismisses any notion of love or emotional attachment, concluding that she will not make plain the reason for my whim, nor analyze the passion of my brain. For a woman to write with such emotional and sexual autonomy in 1923 was a radical act. Her open marriage to Eugène was another source of endless fascination and debate. They both had affairs, and they were honest with each other about them. To many, this was a sign of a deeply dysfunctional or loveless marriage. But to their friends, and in their own letters, it was presented as the only way such a fiercely independent woman could be partnered. It was an attempt to create a new kind of relationship, one that did not demand ownership or sacrifice freedom. Whether it was a successful model or coping mechanism for a woman incapable of traditional intimacy remains a complex and unsettled question. It highlights the central debate of her life. Was her fierce independence a source of strength, or did it ultimately prevent her from finding a lasting peace? Perhaps the most significant and often overlooked controversy of her career came in her later years during World War II. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Millay had been a devoted and outspoken pacifist. She wrote poems condemning war and injustice, and her followers saw her as a leading voice for peace. But the rise of Nazism in Europe horrified her. She came to believe that fascism was an absolute evil that had to be fought, a belief that put her in direct conflict with her long-held pacifist ideals. She threw her considerable fame and talent into the war effort, joining the Writers' War Board and writing scathing propagandistic poetry to rally America against the Axis powers. Works like The Murder of Lytis were powerful and effective as tools of war, but they were a shock to many of her admirers. They saw it as a betrayal of her principles. Furthermore, the poems were artistically uneven, written with a polemical fury that lacked the nuance and grace of her earlier work. She herself was deeply conflicted about it. She felt it was her moral duty to write them, but as a poet, she knew they were not her best work. This chapter of her life is crucial because it shatters the simplistic image of her as a pure, rebellious artist. It shows a woman grappling with the world's brutal realities, forced to compromise her artistic and philosophical ideals in the face of what she saw as an existential threat. It reveals a complex, tormented figure, not a simple icon. The legacy of Edna St Vincent Millay is as layered and contradictory as her life. Her most immediate and undeniable significance is her role as a trailblazing feminist icon. Long before the term was in common usage, she lived the life of a liberated woman. She was financially independent, sexually autonomous, and intellectually defiant. She created a blueprint for the new woman of the 20th century, proving that a woman could be both a serious artist and an unapologetic, complex human being. She claimed for herself the same freedoms that male artists had always taken for granted, and in doing so, she opened a door for generations of women writers and artists who followed. Her impact on American poetry is equally profound. In an age dominated by the dense academic and often obscure work of high modernists like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, Millay made poetry popular again. She wrote with a direct emotional clarity that spoke to a wide audience. Her readings were major cultural events. People bought her books not because they felt they should, but because they loved them. She proved that poetry could still be a vital, relevant part of the cultural conversation. She masterfully blended traditional forms, like the sonnet, with utterly modern attitudes and language, creating a unique and accessible style that bridged the 19th and 20th centuries. But her story also serves as a poignant and cautionary tale. It's a story about the immense pressures of fame and the danger of becoming a symbol. She was trapped by the very myth she helped create, the myth of the girl who burned her candle at both ends. The public wanted her to be forever young, forever rebellious, forever the dazzling icon of Greenwich Village. This left little room for the real woman to age, to suffer, to change. Her life also stands as a heartbreaking testament to the devastating power of chronic pain and addiction, and how they can silence even the most brilliant of voices. She still matters because her life forces us to confront these difficult truths about the price of art, the fragility of the human body and mind, and the lonely struggle that often lies behind a radiant public facade. In the early morning hours of October 19th, 1950, a neighbor found her. Edna St Vincent Millay lay at the bottom of the main staircase at Steepletop. She was 68 years old, but looked far older. She had died of a heart attack and fallen, and had been lying there all night. She was dressed for bed, and on a small table on the landing above there was a glass of wine and a book of poetry. She died as she had lived for that last lonely year, completely alone. It was a quiet, almost mundane end for a life that had been lived with such thunderous passion. The rebellious girl from Maine, the queen of Greenwich Village, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet had been extinguished, but the light from her candle, though it could not last the night, had been so incredibly lovely. Her life was a testament to the beautiful, savage, and often tragic contradictions of the human heart. She pursued beauty, truth, and freedom with a relentless passion, and while she was ultimately consumed by her own flame, she left behind a body of work that continues to illuminate the darkest corners of our shared human experience, a light that has not dimmed